Farewell, John.
Those were senators paying tribute to their colleague, Senator John McCain. Joining us now to talk more about McCain's legacy on the U.S. Senate is independent Maine Senator Angus King. Good morning, Senator.
Good morning, Allison.
Boy, it sure gives you a lump in your throat to listen to all of the tributes pouring in for Senator John McCain. And beyond the personal inspiration, because you were on committees with him and have known him for so long, I'm wondering what will be missed now in the Senate with his loss?
Well, I think, and this has been commented on, he had two characteristics that were remarkable. One was an instinct for compromise and for finding common ground. That's what that final statement that John played just a few minutes ago said, that we are a country that has more in common than we have dividing us, but we seem to be focusing on the divisions right now. He was a person that reached across the aisle, most notably in my career here, on working on the bipartisan immigration bill, which got 68 votes in the Senate. I mean, what gets 68 votes these days? Didn't get taken up in the House, but he was one of the keys to making that happen. He understood how essential that was in a democracy. And one of the things that worries me, Allison, is that we're getting to the point where compromise itself is viewed as a dirty word, as something that you can lose an election over if you're viewed as being reasonable. That's number one. That was one of his great legacies, I think, that we all have to remind ourselves. The other thing that I haven't heard mentioned in the last couple of days, he was one of the few politicians I've ever seen who would admit mistakes. He talked about, in fact, in the final statement, he said, I've made lots of mistakes. I hope the good has outbalanced the bad. For example, in his recent book, astonishingly, he admits that his support for the Iraq war was a mistake. Now, I can remember as recently as 5 years ago, he was all still gung-ho about the surge and the Iraq war. That's an important element of humility, I think, that's an essence of real leadership.
Oh, he seemed to personify, I think, humility. I mean, Jake Tapper was asking him how he wants to be remembered, and he once again was self-deprecating and said that, he admits that he's made lots of mistakes. I mean, he's publicly admitted that his choice for vice president and his presidential bid was a mistake. He says things that are impolitic. I mean, that was obviously part of his charm. And so moving forward, what do you think will happen with, I'm thinking of armed forces and foreign relations, things that were so important to him. And of course, I'm thinking about that because of North Korea. And it seems as though whatever deal existed, if there even was such a thing, agreed upon with a gentleman's handshake between President Trump and Kim Jong-un, seems to be falling apart. There's this secret letter that the Washington Post has first reported on about how it's from Pyongyang. They seem to want to, I guess, rewrite some of the agreement. And then, as you know, President Trump decided that Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, should not go back for another visit. So where are we?
Well, I think one of the problems is that this administration doesn't seem to want to remember history. This is the fifth time we've been in negotiations about nuclear weapons with North Korea, and the dance has been pretty much the same each time. They come up, they talk about making concessions and backing off. They get concessions from us or from the Chinese or from other people that are interested, and then they backslide. So this is not unusual, and I'm afraid what worries me is that the administration might lurch from excessive optimism to excessive pessimism and let slip at least an opportunity to keep talking. I think this is a long road, and it's not going to happen overnight. What worries me is that they're going to stop negotiations, and then we're back with some very, very unattractive alternatives. I think, John McCain was no slouch when it came to the use of military force, but I think he understood the extremely dangerous situation in North Korea, probably the most dangerous situation in the world right now, and that talks continuing towards some kind of goal and realistic goal in terms of timing and what we might actually achieve, that's what we've got to do.
Well, I mean, it sounds like those talks are falling apart, particularly since President Trump has canceled Mike Pompeo's fourth trip there just hours before it was supposed to happen. And so do you understand today what did come out of that meeting with Kim Jong-un and President Trump, other than elevating Kim Jong-un on a national stage, what the U.S. did get?
Well, it certainly did that, and you know, I was just pretty skeptical at the time, again because I've seen the history unfold going back 25 years that anything really concrete was accomplished. To me, what was accomplished was simply opening a channel between our two leaders that could lead to something productive if Kim Jong-un is finally ready to say we don't need these weapons. But we've got to understand that they view nuclear weapons as an insurance policy. And frankly, I think our abrogating the Iran deal didn't do any good in terms of these negotiations, because if you're Kim, you say, well, wait a minute, I signed an agreement with these guys on nuclear weapons, and 3 years later, it's just thrown in the trash can. So it's a long process, and I think the president was overly optimistic when he is flying home and saying, you know, North Korea is no longer a worry. That wasn't the case. But as I say, what worries me is we'll go from that excessive optimism to nothing will work, no more discussions, cancel meetings, and then we're in a very, very dangerous place because there are no good options. I can tell you from serving on the Armed Services and Intelligence Committees there's no such thing as a surgical strike. This is not something where we want to face some kind of military result.
Yeah. Back to Senator John McCain's legacy. Chuck Schumer, Senate Minority Leader, has suggested that the Russell Senate Office Building be renamed
the Naval Academy at Annapolis. I feel like it must be a true tribute to your friendship. And maybe one last joke from Senator McCain that he's inviting an Army guy to deliver a tribute on the grounds of the Naval Academy. But it must be so meaningful to you to have that invitation.
Well, it is, and especially as a West Point graduate, it'll be a great honor to recall the extraordinary feeling that our men and women in uniform had for him. They knew that no one had their backs more than he did. They knew that no one was doing more for them to ensure that they had the means to prevail in the combat of the post-9/11 wars. He was out there with us all the time, every recess, even when running, even when campaigning. He was out with us every 4th of July. I noted yesterday to someone that I was in Iraq or Afghanistan for 7 of the 10 4th of July after 9/11. I think he was there for all of those, and I think for the others as well. Our troops loved him, and they knew that he loved them.
You say he had their backs. He had your back. Very much so back in 2007 during the surge.
Well, no question about it. And you'll recall, as you were covering him, I think, that he said, I would rather lose an election than lose a war. And this is because of his strong support for the surge. And it meant everything. He and the other 2 members of the Three Amigos, Senators Lieberman and Graham, were truly the most supportive of all. In the Senate, at various points, the tally showed that the support for the effort overall was hanging by 1 vote. The first 6 months were particularly difficult. He stayed with us. And the results, I think, in the end, validated his confidence in our strategy and in our men and women in uniform. And, you know, at the end of the day, the irony is that his support for that enabled it to succeed. We drove violence down by over 85% in the 18 or 19 months of the surge, and that enormously benefited the actual victor, the individual who defeated him, Senator Obama, when he became president, because it enabled him to do what it was that he was seeking to do, which was to draw down without the entire place falling apart.
Now, it's interesting when you talk about the military. Yes, he had your back, and he had your back personally, but that does not mean he wasn't willing to deliver withering criticism at times to generals. We've heard from generals who say there is no one tougher on me at times than Senator McCain when he was chairman of the Armed Services Committee or just a member. Oh,
no, and I had some of these moments. I remember right after the confirmation vote, and so I'd been confirmed to go to Iraq to command the surge, and my aide handed me the phone and said, Senator McCain wants to talk to you. And so I thought this was going to be a warm congratulatory call. And I said, Senator, thanks so much for all you did to support me during this process. And he said, when do you leave? I said, Senator, he said, when do you go to Baghdad? And I said, well, I go back to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and wrap things up. And he hung up. I mean, he was impatient. He was relentless. He was determined. And all these are admirable qualities in my book because, frankly, I probably exhibited quite a few of them as well.
So you try and have tried for a long time to stay separate from politics. I think it is one you respect from people like Senator McCain and President Obama and others on both sides
Very
of the
much
aisle.
so. You know, you have to rise above differences at certain times. And by the way, I think that among the times when you should rise above differences is death.
Okay, so let's talk about that. So how do you make sense of what happened these last few days? And yes, ultimately, 2 days later, President Trump did release a statement saying he respected the service of John McCain. And ultimately, the flag of the White House was lowered to half-staff. And ultimately, the president said words out loud last night. But it took a while to get there. So what are we to make of that?
Well, obviously, it took too long. Again, this is one of those times.